Guten Morgen miteinander, bienvenue, welcome. We welcome you to the third day of the study days for the Renewal of Theology and Society, and it's a great honor that we are in the process of discussing the book of Paul by N.T. Wright. Pretty heavy work. It has been called by one of the guests a bomb. Oh, actually, the rector was stopped at an airport with this book that they and searched for, say, what is this? And they found out it was the book of N.T. Wright. So we're very happy. For today, we have special guests with us. We are very honored to have His Eminency Kardinal Kurt Koch with us, and of course, the president of the Schweizerische Evangelische Kirchenbund, Dr. Gottfried Locher, and of course Tom Wright, and then also Martin Bühlmann, the head of the Vineyard movement in the German-speaking world. Those three will discuss this afternoon with N.T. Wright, but we're very honored for you to be here, and we're honored that you're here. Thank you for coming to these days. It has been a very interesting and hotly discussion or hotly received questions. We have been wrestling with 6 lectures and question and answers sessions and so far, and now we come to the question of how Paul saw unity. So we would also like to welcome Miteinander unterwegs. They have declared this day to be their study day, and they are with us. So we welcome you, and that's also where Martin works with. So welcome to everybody, and thank you for joining us. I think there's still some more to come, but I would like to invite Professor Wright to start with his first lecture on unity.
Also, guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And for those who are new today, my apologies, dass ich kann nicht so gut in Deutsch sprechen, and I can also, je ne peux pas très bien parler en français, also, so I have to speak English. In all the work that has been done on St. Paul, one of the great paradoxes is that we have failed to emphasize Paul's repeated teaching on the unity of the church. We have in the West read Paul primarily as the theologian of salvation, and we have seen salvation in personal and individual terms. And of course, this too is quite appropriate. Paul was deeply concerned, as he says, that he might by all means save some. Many passages in many letters are devoted to this theme. But by comparison, his teaching on the unity of the church and on the need to work to make that unity a reality is an even greater theme. For every passage discussing justification by faith, there are 6 or 8 passages talking about the unity of the church. Indeed, sometimes the two overlap. One of Paul's major arguments about justification is also a plea for unity. We shall return to this. That is Galatians 2 I am referring to there. In the present lecture, I want to look at the deep roots of Paul's teaching on church unity. And then, the second half of this morning, the last lecture, I shall look at the pathways to unity which Paul mapped out for his churches. As we do this, I take comfort from the fact that the problem of unity is not merely a modern issue. Right from the start, as we see in the Acts of the Apostles. The church faced the problem of how to hold together a new sort of community. This community was always threatening to break up along ethnic lines, as in Acts chapter 6 or Galatians chapter 2, or social lines, as in 1 Corinthians 11, the rich and the poor, or Philemon, the slave and the master, or because of personality cults, as in 1 Corinthians 1 to 4, or political and social pressure, as in Philippians. And this is before we even reach theological disagreements or problems. Indeed, again and again in the letters, as we have seen, Paul is teaching the church to engage in theological reflection through scripture, prayer, worship, meditation, and shared teaching and discussion, in order to hold the community together against those multiple and dangerous pressures. In and through it all, Paul is teaching a strong sense of identity. In today's postmodern world, we know all about identity politics. Many of today's sharp issues emerge from puzzles over identity, whether it be within Europe, and in my country, whether we want to see ourselves within Europe or not, and within different countries, the identity of various regions, whether it be Scotland in the United Kingdom, the Basques and the Catalans in Spain, or further east, the Crimea within Ukraine, the Ukraine within a greater Russia, and so on. Then there are the identity politics of gender and sexuality. Then also of the different economic strata and the way they perceive themselves and their needs and grievances. And for us also, this was not true for Paul, the politics of skin color, which adds a visible dimension to ethnic tensions. Today, within the larger Christian church, we have become used to this identity taking on long-lasting forms which we call denominations, of which, of course, the early church knew nothing. Denominations have traditionally expressed their differences in theological language. Some of those disputes have been real enough, though we cannot ignore the extent to which these theological differences, expressed in liturgy and polity, sometimes happen to coincide with social, cultural, and ethnic divisions. One must constantly ask whether the theological differences are the real problem, or whether the task of theology, which for Paul was to be the means of unity, has been hijacked by the desire to solidify or legitimate particular subgroupings within the church. Whatever we think about that, Paul had seen day by day that a sense of identity of whatever sort, and the markers which went with that sense, could easily creep into the church, importing social or cultural differences and trying to give them a Christian flavor. Paul refuses to collude with this. The most obvious division, against which he struggled again and again, was that between Jewish and non-Jewish believers in Jesus. But there were many other divisions too, and wherever they occurred, he insisted that they had to be overcome. There is one well-known exception, even though this may be said in irony. When Paul addresses the factions in the Corinthian church, he does admit that there are bound to be such factions, chapter 11, verse 19, since, he says, that is how you can tell who are genuine and who are not. Already in Corinth, Paul seems to have been faced with the problem of people flooding into the church because it was the new, interesting religious phenomenon. It was the latest fad. Such people needed to be challenged with the high and hard demands of the gospel and of the lifestyle it generated. Paul, perhaps dangerously, designates the two groups, the genuine and the rest, as the pneumatikoi, the spiritual, and the sarkinoi, the fleshly. At least that is one explanation for those words. They are difficult words. But he does not do this in order to legitimate any division, but precisely to challenge the sarkinoi to become pneumatikoi. His aim is still unity. And this unity will not be what in English we call, with the mathematical term, a lowest common denominator unity. Paul is going for the much higher and harder prize, the full, rich unity in which the Messiah's life is expressed in the power of the Spirit. Why did this matter to him so much? Granted that it was difficult to maintain this unity, why did he not settle for special interest groups of Christians? Why not have one gathering in one part of town for the Jewish Christians and another somewhere else for the Gentile Christians? Wouldn't that have been much easier? Why not have all the Christian slaves meeting in one place and the Christian free men meeting somewhere else? Wouldn't that make life easier all round? We only have to suggest this to see that such a proposal would have been anathema to Paul. Although, as I say this, I am reminded that in the town where I grew up in the north of England, very often the different Christian churches reflected very accurately the social and cultural differences within the town. Ask me about that afterwards if you want to know the details. What about, for Paul, the Christian groups in the great metropolis, Rome itself? Today in London and New York, and I dare say in Rome and Paris and Munich and Vienna, perhaps even in the great cities of Switzerland itself, we have churches for this ethnic group and that ethnic group. They continue their own customs and worship styles with minimum reference to people down the street who are likewise worshipping in the style to which they are accustomed and preaching their particular theology. Why did Paul not settle for that kind of system? In Romans 14 and 15, he seems to be addressing exactly that situation. He knows of several house churches in Rome, and it is probable that they were divided in terms of their background and place of origin, expressed in cultural practices which formed barriers to fellowship with the other groups. So again, why did this higher, richer unity matter so much to Paul? And how have we managed to get it so wrong? In the previous lectures, I have argued that we can best see the whole of Paul's theology in terms of the Jewish themes of monotheism, election, and eschatology. And I now want to suggest, and I have hinted at this earlier in the week, I want to suggest that each of these contributes vitally to Paul's belief in unity. He saw the church as a sign to the world that there was indeed one Creator God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God revealed in the gospel over against the many gods of the nations. That was the primary missionary imperative, to reveal to the world that the one God of Israel was the true and only God, and to do so by announcing that this one God had acted decisively in world history, launching his kingdom in and through his Son Jesus, Israel's Messiah and the world's true Lord. The imperative to unity comes about because Paul believed that this God was putting his worldwide kingdom into effect under Jesus' lordship, and that by the Spirit, the church was the sign of this kingdom and this Lord. So I shall now therefore explore this in more detail, showing how each of the three elements of Paul's theology points towards this unity and thus acts as a strong motivation for it. And that will prepare us for the final lecture, in which I will sketch the Pauline path, step by step, to unity. Again, we remind ourselves that the challenge of unity is not a new thing. It isn't a problem we have invented in the modern period. It goes back to the first century, to the first Christian generation. But we have colluded with disunity for so long, pretending that our denomination is the only true church. And we have put off the demanding task which Paul, like the rest of the New Testament, lays before us. So first then, the unity of the church is to be an active sign of monotheism. In two key passages, Paul makes the equation: one God, one people of God. And in both of these passages, this applies specifically to the challenge of the Jew-Gentile separation in the church. I begin with one of the most difficult verses in Paul. It's actually too hot to discuss this verse today, but I'm going to do it anyway. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 20, Paul argues that the Torah was given through angels by the hand of a mediator, and then he says, "He, however, is not the mediator of one, but God is one." And this leads to the question, is the Torah therefore against the promises of God? A question to which Paul predictably answers no. What's going on here? Without going into the detail, which I have published elsewhere in the big book and also in some articles, we must note that the whole chapter Galatians 3 concerns the family of Abraham, and it addresses the question whether Abraham has a single family composed of both Jewish and Gentile believers or not. To this question, Paul answers emphatically, yes, Abraham has a single family. And if you belong to the Messiah, you are indeed Abraham's seed. The seed is the clue to the complexity of the chapter, because Paul is using seed here in its collective sense to mean family, as he is also using the word Christos to mean both Messiah and the Messiah and his people. He does this, of course, in 1 Corinthians 1 and 12, where he talks about Christos, meaning the whole family of God. As the body is one and has many members, hutos kai ho Christos, even so is the Messiah. But this conclusion appears to fly in the face of Torah, which specifies that only those who perform the works of Torah will count as Abraham's genuine family. And that, we must assume, is what has been said by the agitators who have been troubling the Galatians. Paul's argument against that position is based on his exposition of Genesis 15 and other similar passages, where God made promises to Abraham concerning his worldwide family and their inheritance. He argues that since the promises always envisaged a worldwide family, the Torah cannot be allowed to disrupt that ultimate intent. He will shortly go on to explain the time-limited function of Torah. But his basic point here is that the Mosaic Torah left to itself would create two or even more families, since it would form a permanent wedge between Jewish believers and all others. And this, he says, cannot be what God intended. So he says, verse 20, the law was given through the mediator Moses, but Moses cannot be the mediator of the single family. Moses, however, is not the mediator of the one, but the single family is what God always intended, since God is one. This argument is one of the most dense and elusive in Paul, but it seems to me that that is the best explanation of what is going on. And this belongs closely with the other easier, more explicit passage in Romans 3:27-31. This falls within the exposition of the divine righteousness, dikaiosune, in Romans 3:21-4:25, again closely linked with the exposition of the Abrahamic covenant. Paul's point is that justification must be by faith, not works of Torah, otherwise God would be God of the Jews only, whereas in fact he is God of the Gentiles also. Yes, says Paul, God of Gentiles also, ipa his ho theos, since God is one, the God who will justify the circumcised on the ground of their faith and the uncircumcised through their faith. The monotheism at the heart of the Jewish and Christian world is thus the ultimate reason for Paul's insistence that there is a single family composed of all believers. As we have seen yesterday, justification by faith is itself complex and dense. And one of its key meanings, not the only meaning, but one of them, is that faith is the same badge for Jew and Gentile alike. The people of God cannot be demarcated by works of Torah because those works mark off the Jew from the Gentile who doesn't have Torah. Paul has already explained that if God's people were to be defined by Torah, the result would be universal condemnation, Romans 3:20, because through the law comes the knowledge of sin. Perhaps I should just add a sentence to make this clear. Those of us who have stressed that for Paul works of Torah are the things which divide the Jew from the Gentile, are sometimes accused of forgetting that what really matters with Torah is whether you break it or not. Not so. This is how it works. Paul says to his fellow Jews, if you go into this area which is fenced off by Torah in order to stay pure away from the Gentiles, you will find that the Torah says to you, you have broken me. So your choice is either join the Messiah's family, leaving behind those markers of Torah, or come back into the Torah and find that it tells you that you are a sinner. Now he explains in chapter 3, verse 21, that God has therefore acted apart from the law to provide justification through the Messiah's faithfulness, 3:22, and that this justification is for all without distinction. Theologians sometimes forget that the argument runs straight on from Romans 3:21 to 26, as I said yesterday, to 3:27 to 31, and indeed into chapter 4. If you look at 3:29, when he says, or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not of Gentiles also? The first word, or, is often omitted, at least in English translations. I haven't checked German and French ones. But Paul's little word, which is one letter in Greek, says it all. The point is, if justification were through works of the law, it would mean that God would be the God of Jews only. Monotheism thus undergirds the unity of the new family, the family long ago promised to Abraham. That's what Paul then expounds in chapter 4. There is a third passage which also presents Paul's monotheism at the heart of church unity. We have already looked at 1 Corinthians 8:6 in connection with Paul's Christological monotheism. I want now to glance at its relevance to the question of unity. 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10 seem to be about what we would call an ethical question. Should Christians eat meat that has been offered to idols? Paul, who always looks from a pastoral angle, sees that underneath this is a question of the contested unity of the church. If some believers, following Paul in the view which he calls strong, decide that they are free to eat any meat, whatever its previous history, in other words, whether or not it has been offered in worship to an idol, if Paul, if they follow Paul in the view which he calls strong, they may create scandal and division within the church. Paul wants all believers to come to this strong position. But while some, perhaps many, remain in the position he calls weak, he will abstain for the sake of their consciences. I will return to this later this morning. But I simply note, once again, that his statement on monotheism, chapter 8, verses 1 to 6, which climaxes, you remember, with the Shema, with Jesus within it, one God, one Lord, this is the foundation of his argument. First, all meat belongs to God, and hence can be eaten by his people if they give thanks. That is the monotheist part of his argument. But then second, those who belong to the crucified and risen Jesus must be prepared to give up their rights for the sake of one another. That is the messianic part part of the argument. Paul maintains this delicate pastoral balance in the service of the unity of the church, and he does so for the sake of and on the basis of his revised monotheism. Now, in making this point, I have already touched upon the way in which Paul's revised doctrine of election likewise necessitates church unity. And I now return to that subject specifically. Here, one of the key texts is Galatians 2, referring to the incident at Antioch. The church in Antioch, Paul explains, had been used to sharing a common table at which Jewish believers and Gentile believers were equally welcome. Then some came from James, from Jerusalem, and Peter and even Barnabas drew back and separated themselves. So now you have two tables, a table for Jewish Christians and a table for Gentile Christians. Now, there is considerable debate among scholars as to how far Jews in the diaspora did or did not share food sometimes on occasion with some Gentiles. There's a big debate about that. But here it seems clear that Peter and Barnabas and the others were conscious of a prohibition against eating with uncircumcised people, as we see also in the discussions in Acts 11 and so on. Against this position, Paul advances one of his sharpest statements of redefined election. In Galatians 2:11-21, he explains how the situation had arisen. And then he declares in 2:15-16 the basis of membership in God's renewed people. One is not justified by works of Torah, but through the faithfulness of the Messiah. The Messiah's faithful death has carried with it the fate and the identity of God's people. Verse 19, I, through the law, died to the law, that I might live to God. I am crucified with the Messiah, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but the Messiah lives in me. Paul is not talking about a special experience which he had had, a special spiritual revelation or something like that. The whole point of the argument is that this is what is true of all Jews who believe in the Messiah. That's why he says it here. And perhaps I should just add, I think the reason he says I is because he doesn't want to say they or even you. He wants to make it clear that this very sharp, difficult thing is something he himself fully owns, he is part of. When you belong to the Messiah, you are incorporated into him. 2:17, you are justified in the Messiah, so that what is true of the Messiah is true of you, and here especially his death and resurrection. This is at the heart of Paul's redefinition of election, and here it serves specifically as the argument for united table fellowship, upon which Paul insists as the truth of the gospel. My second example of redefined election undergirding church unity comes from Romans. I mentioned it already, but I want to develop now. In chapters 14 and 15, Paul advances a complex and careful argument for the mutual welcome which he wants to see between the different churches and house groups in Rome. This reaches its climax with a list, a catena of biblical passages, which insists on the shared worship of Jews and Gentiles alike together in God's people. This is chapter 15, verses 7 to 13. This is an explicitly messianic ecclesiology. Paul's argument here begins, 15 verse 7 and 8, with the Messiah's welcome and servant ministry. Welcome one another as the Messiah welcomed you. And it ends with the quotation of Isaiah 11, in which the root of Jesse will stand as an ensign to the peoples. The fuller statement of the Messiah's achievements in verses 8 and 9 indicate that the reason why the Messiah fulfilled God's promises to the patriarchs was to bring the Gentiles in to share in the praises of God's people. Within Romans, of course, this looks back to the argument of chapter 4 and also 9 and 10. And within Paul's overall thought, we seem here to be in the same area as Romans 8. The Abrahamic inheritance of the land had been widened through the messianic promises to include the whole world. For Paul, the unity of the church is the necessary consequence of God's action in renewing and reshaping election through the crucified and risen Messiah. Quote, "The Messiah became a servant to the circumcised on behalf of God's truthfulness to confirm the promises to the patriarchs and that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy." Paul then quotes from Deuteronomy, the Psalms, and Isaiah. This is quite deliberate. The Torah, the writings, the prophets. And it all points on to hope. The Gentiles will hope in him, 15:12, and the God of hope will fill them with joy and peace, so that they may abound in hope. Election thus leads to eschatology, and to this I now turn. Here I draw particularly on the letter to the Ephesians. Many exegetes in the last 2 centuries have questioned the Pauline authenticity of Ephesians. The arguments include questions of style, but the weight normally falls on the theological content. My proposal is that it is precisely the normal Western, particularly Protestant reading of Paul, the rest of Paul, that has made Ephesians problematic. Paul has been seen as concerned with individual salvation, not with the church and its unity. Therefore, Ephesians falls off to the side. But if I am right about Romans, Galatians, the Corinthian correspondence, which we've already discussed, and I will soon add Philippians there as well, then this main emphasis of Ephesians is not eccentric. It is central to Paul. In particular, the promise of Ephesians 1:10 is exactly in line with Paul's eschatological thought elsewhere. He says, God's purpose is to sum up all things in the Messiah, things in heaven and things on earth. That is a classic Jewish vision of the divine purpose, going right back to Genesis 1. And it is set here in Ephesians 1 within a prayer of benediction, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, and so on, in which Paul draws on the Exodus narrative to speak of the divine purpose of redemption, leading, as the Exodus narrative does, to the inheritance for which the Spirit is the advance guarantee. This is very close in substance to Romans 8, but it is redrawn, as that chapter is, around the Messiah and the Spirit. This is new Exodus language, messianic Exodus language, Spirit Exodus language. And Ephesians 1, with its emphasis on God bringing heaven and earth together, is then the basis for the remarkable emphasis on unity throughout much of the rest of the letter. In chapter 2, the statement of God's rescue operation, saving people from sin, occupies verses 1 through 10. And it leads directly then to a long statement of the way in which this rescue operation has brought Gentiles in from the outside into the single family of God. Chapter 2, verse 11 to 22. We might have guessed from the first chapter where this would lead. The place where heaven and earth were joined together in the Jewish vision of the world was, of course, the temple. The promise of heaven and earth unity in 1:10 thus points forward to the new temple in 2:19 to 21, the community in which the living God has come to dwell by the Spirit. This is the Jewish eschatological theme of the new temple. It goes all the way back to Ezekiel, some of the Qumran texts, etc. But it is revised around Messiah and Spirit. And it is explicitly concerned with the unity of God's people across the traditional Jew-Gentile barriers. Or rather, not so much across them as by demolishing them, breaking down the dividing wall of hostility. Chapter 2, verse 14. Breaking down the enmity between the divisions of humanity, which was reflected only too clearly in the wall that kept out the Gentiles from the inner court of the temple in Jerusalem. This same theme of unity is underscored in chapter 3, with the ingathering of Gentiles into the single family being the object of the new apocalypse, the revelation of the mystery which now drives Paul's missionary work. This too is a Jewish eschatological theme, the idea that for long ages there has been a divine mystery waiting to be unveiled, and now God has pulled back the curtain in Christ so that at last we can see what it was that God had in mind all along, the divine purpose to unite all races in one. This has a directly missionary objective. Through this united, though variegated family, the many-colored wisdom of God is to be made known to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places. I'm going to come back to that in the next lecture. This theme of unity is then developed in very practical ways in Ephesians 4. This could just as well be discussed under the heading of election, since it is all about the way the one community is constituted. But I place it here under eschatology because of the forward look of chapter 4, verse 15. Paul says, "We are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into the Messiah." We should note very carefully how this argument works. On the one hand, Paul believes that there is a unity in the Spirit which is already given and must be maintained. Verse 3, maintain the unity of the Spirit. This is already a reality. But he also believes, on the other hand, that multiple ministries are given to the church so that it may grow up into the Messiah. That is, 4:13, into the measure of the stature of the fullness of the Messiah. This is a typical eschatological now and not yet point. There is a unity which is already given, and there is a deeper, richer unity into which the church must strive to grow. Paul sees the church as held between that already given unity and that future complete unity. And this provides the context for the long, detailed ethical section of the letter beginning in 4:17, in which the holiness of the people of God is part of the same vocation as the unity. So there are the three main elements of this lecture. Unity matters to Paul because of monotheism, election, and eschatology. First, it matters to Paul because it is both demanded and enabled by God himself, the one God of ancient Jewish monotheism, now seen vividly by Paul in terms of Messiah and Spirit. Second, it is the form which election must now take, now that election itself has been redefined through the crucified and risen Messiah and the renewing work of the Spirit. The Messiah's work was for all, and the Spirit's work is in all, so that there can be no distinction between Jew and Gentile or anyone else. From this, we could move outwards, and we will in the next lecture, to show that the unity Paul envisages between Jew and Gentile in Christ is the paradigm for the unity between slave and free and male and female, which emerges at various points. As you know, Paul says that in Galatians 3:28. So it matters because of monotheism, it matters because of election, and third, unity matters to Paul because the unity of the church is a sign of the Creator's purpose in bringing all things together in the Messiah, things in heaven and things on earth. Unity is thus not simply an imperative which the church must struggle to obey. It is the sign that points forward to the eschatological purposes of God. Not to maintain and work for this unity is thus implicitly to abandon the promise of uniting heaven and earth. It is implicitly, if I dare put it like this, to stop praying that God's kingdom will come on earth as in heaven. Now, much Western Christianity has indeed abandoned the hope of heaven and earth coming together in favor of a different expectation altogether, giving up earth and going for heaven instead. Perhaps we should not be surprised that within the same Western Christianity there has been little, if any, emphasis on unity, and instead a cheerful willingness to go along with more and more disunity. Perhaps it's time to take Ephesians seriously once more. In concluding this lecture, I want to focus on two of Paul's most famous appeals for unity. Both of them concern the Messiah as the focus and model of this unity. Both of them demand the Spirit as the driving force of this unity. The first is Philippians 2:1-18. This is a carefully designed piece of writing with the well-known poem of 2:6-11 at its heart. Whatever we say about the origin of this poem, was it written by somebody else? Is Paul quoting it? Whatever. Paul has used it deliberately within this quite subtle appeal. This most famous statement of Paul's Christology, as we saw, it is a specifically Christological monotheism, is the driving energy which stands behind the appeal for unity in 2:1-5 and the appeal for holiness in 2:12-18. And Paul's appeal is focused on verse 5. Have this mind among yourselves, which you have in Messiah Jesus. This is the point I made on the first day about teaching the church to think theologically. In other words, you are to learn to think with the kind of love, fellowship, and humility that will facilitate the rich unity described in verses 1-5. To have the same thought, the same love, the same soul, the same object of thought, without envy or boasting or rivalry. Learning to think in the messianic pattern is thus the ground and means of a remarkable unity. The same is true of the appeal for holiness in verses 12-18. The church is to shine as a light in the world, holding forth the word of life. That is what Paul's mission is aimed at, generating and sustaining communities that demonstrate to the world that there is a different way to be human, that there is a different Kyrios, that the true God is different to the gods and lords that are worshipped in other ways by other peoples. And this witness is only possible if the community is united. So the Messiah's story in verses 6-11 provides not only the central affirmation of faith and the motivation to live in this way, but also the pattern of thought which is necessary if such a life is to be lived. Unity, rooted in the Messiah, constitutes the church as the holy people, the missionary body of the Messiah. I borrowed that phrase, the body of the Messiah, from our final passage. In 1 Corinthians 12, 13 and 14, Paul offers a multi-dimensional picture of the united community. There are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. Varieties of service, but the same Lord. Varieties of operation, but the same God, who performs them all in everyone. And this leads Paul directly to his exposition of the church as the Messiah's body in chapter 12. And this is balanced by his exhortations regarding the conduct of public worship in chapter 14. In between those two, and we must assume again that Paul knows exactly what he's doing, rhetorically speaking, we find the famous passage about love. There is no time here to develop an exegesis of these 3 chapters, but actually there is no need to do so, since simply to draw attention to the passage and the way it works is to make my point. As we know, a great deal earlier on in 1 Corinthians is about the threat to unity. I said before, the first 4 chapters are about personality cults. I am of Paul. I am of Cephas. I am of Apollos. I am of the Messiah. We don't need to know exactly who these different groups were or what views they represented to see what Paul is doing. 1:13, is the Messiah divided? Memeristai ho Christos. And this challenge points all the way on to chapter 12, where, as I said, as the body is one and has many members, hutos kai ho Christos, so also is the Messiah. And in between 1-4 and 12-14, we find some of Paul's most sustained ecclesial discussions dealing with sexual and marital holiness in chapters 5, 6, and 7, with food offered to idols and the threat to unity in 8, 9, and 10, and with problems at the Eucharist in chapter 11. I am, of course, summarizing. There are other themes as well. And the great argument about the resurrection in chapter 15 is not outside this theme either, because there is only one gospel, only one hope, and chapter 15 draws together the threads of earlier arguments in order not only to clarify the resurrection itself, but by doing so to draw together the squabbling and muddled church into a new awareness of its destiny and vocation. So then, in concluding this lecture, I reiterate that Paul's aim in all of this is not merely ecclesial, but also missionary. When Paul hears that the Christians in Philippi are standing firm in one spirit, with one soul, striving for the faith of the gospel, that's 1:27, and that they are not frightened or driven into corners by the opposition that will come, then they are a sign to the watching world, a sign that Jesus is Lord, and that the powers which imagine that they rule the world are impostors and usurpers. As in Ephesians 3:10, where the unity of the church displays to the world the manifold wisdom of God, so here in Philippians, as also in Romans and elsewhere, the unity of the church is directly linked not only to monotheism, election, and eschatology, but also to the vocation of the church, in which all those three find their active purpose. What the church says to the world will not be nearly so powerful a witness as what the church is. That is why it is important to give attention to the practical means of attaining that unity. And that is what I shall be trying to do in the final lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Before the break, I have a few announcements, and we will hear Professor Barbara Hallensleben. I would like to draw your attention to the questionnaire. There are, up on top of the tables, there are those questionnaires and boxes. If there's any question relating to today, unity of the church, we will have a final session of Q&A this afternoon, and we will bundle those questions again to present them to the panel. And also, I would like to make an announcement that during the break, while you have coffee and croissant outside, you might be interested to pick up our pre-flyer for next year's conference, Faith and Globalization, with Miroslav Wolf, Andrea Riccardi, Klaus Leisinger, and Hans-Jörg Schmid. Hans-Jörg Schmid is the new head of the Department for Islam Studies here at the university. So this will be pretty actual, pretty relevant. But for now, I would like to give the word to Professor Hallensleben.
Just a short but important information. Don't be afraid of doctoral students. They are human beings. They do not know everything. They even sometimes have questions. So this means if you are interested to participate tomorrow and also on Saturday morning maybe in the doctoral program, you are most welcome. You have the chance to listen to 3 more contributions of Tom Wright. So on Romans as a whole, so the question how the main topics are internally related. On Romans 5, 1 to 11 as a central pericope. And a statement finally on how biblical studies and systematic theology can fruitfully interact. Tomorrow we will be in a smaller room. It is 3117 on Saturday morning in Notre-Dame de la Route. We will explain where you find it. I just prepared a program on a freshly green sheet of paper. I will put it next to the bookstore so that those who are interested may take the program, and you will see it after the break also here on the screen. Thank you so much. Have a good break.